Debate question that was posed to you was about consumer credit. Is consumer credit a blessing or a curse? And like in the past, we had 5 experts who were on the panel. We started off with Professors Avi Goldfarb and Ron Bolkowski, both of whom are colleagues of mine here at Rotman. And they both talked about why consumer credit is a blessing. Avi made the point, a fundamentally important point, about the fact that consumer credit allows you to smooth consumption over time. That income streams are not uniform, and if you didn't have credit, you would not be able to make big purchases like houses or even smaller things because you would not have money in your pockets at the right point in time. So consumer credit is critically important because it allows us to manage our consumption patterns over time. Ron went on to also talk about 2 other things. He talked about the convenience aspect of it, the fact that with a credit card you could spend in Germany or Hong Kong or wherever you went, and the fact that you might actually also be a member of loyalty points, and so you could actually earn, there were some tangible benefits for doing it. And finally, also the idea that when you use a credit card, you actually don't pay for a period of time. And so it's almost like you have an interest-free loan. And so those were Ron's arguments for why it is a blessing. Min Zhao came in. She didn't disagree with anything that Avi or Ron said, but she made a very important point, which was the fact that people aren't very good at managing credit, and that's key. So she talked about the fact that people aren't good at keeping track of their expenses. The more they use credit, the less likely they are to remember how much they've spent, and that they're overconfident in their ability to pay back. And one other very important point she said in the end, and it's also been discussed in many recent books, is that credit cards can contribute, in fact, be perhaps one of the biggest drivers of an impulsive society. Why? Because it makes it very easy to make a purchase. I think about it, I buy a lot of books on Amazon.com, and Amazon has my credit information. They have a little button at the top which says one-click purchase, and before you know it, you've bought a book. And it's incredibly easy to buy. You don't even have to think a whole lot. And so consumer credit does have the ability to cause impulsivity. We then had Professor Andrew Ching, who talked about the hidden cost of consumer credit, in particular credit cards. So he made the point that merchants have to pay fees when they accept credit cards, and as a result of those fees, somebody has to cover them. How do they get covered? They get covered because all of us end up paying a higher price. So there are these hidden costs that we need to think about. And then finally, Professor Amar Chima couldn't join us in person, but he sent us his comments. He echoed Min Zhao's position. So there's one consistent theme that comes up through not just your comments, but also the comments of our panelists, which is that consumer credit is a tool. And like any tool, it can be used or misused. Very fundamentally, the use of consumer credit, and in particular credit cards, is a mental accounting story. Think about mental accounting. We talked about the idea that you need to set up these accounts, and then you need to meter your purchases. You need to keep track of them. You need to allocate them to each mental account. Credit cards make it difficult to meter. It's very hard because the credit card process is very different. It's easy to pay with credit cards. It doesn't leave a strong memory trace in your head. And a lot of people simply forget the number of items that they have purchased using consumer credit. So it does become really hard to keep track of your expenses. The pain associated of making that payment with credit is much lower than the pain with cash or with checks. But it also has an effect on the scope of the mental account. Remember, we talked about the fact that you should be able to clearly segregate your different expense categories. Credit cards don't let you do that because now it's just this one account called credit card bill. And so it becomes hard to keep track of exactly how much you're spending in these different categories. There is finally also a timing problem. When you are using cash primarily, you typically have a monthly cycle. You earn at the beginning of the month, you get your salary at the end of the month again, and so you can budget by the month. With consumer credit, and in particular with credit cards, your credit card billing cycle doesn't coincide with your planning cycle. Can you think of credit cards where the billing cycle begins on the 1st and ends on the 30th? They're extremely rare. So credit card billing cycles are delayed. You end up getting a bill 40 days after you make a purchase. It just becomes hard to keep track of the timing as well. And so the cycles don't match. So these are all fundamental problems with using consumer credit. If they can be overcome, then a lot of the other benefits we talked about are great. Convenience is fantastic. It allows you to smoothen out consumption. But we do have these mental accounting issues. Now, let's talk for a minute about fees. Andrew talked about fees more generally. And in fact, with consumer credit, there are a lot of fees. There are late payment fees, there are default fees. And in fact, a lot of consumers will complain that they didn't know about those fees. Now, if you actually open up your credit card statement and look at the back, most cases, the back of your statement will disclose every single fee. But if you look at it closely, it's written in a small font size. It is hard to read. Most of us ignore that information. So disclosure becomes important. And a number of years back, President Obama in the United States signed the Card Act. It was a similar act in Canada as well, which required disclosure to be done in standard formats. And it also required disclosures to be done using consumer-friendly language. So think about the APR, the purchase rate. This is a concept that is hard for many consumers to understand. A lot of people will tell you, based on some of my informal surveys, that a 20% APR is twice as bad as a 10% APR. But that's not the case. It's actually many times worse because you compound your interest over time. But a lot of people don't understand that. And so would it not be a better thing to simply say that if you only continue to pay the minimum that you owed, it would take you 5 years or 6 years or whatever the time was to finish making your payments. And so that's what the Card Act mandates that providers of consumer credit do. And that's an important step in making policy which is consumer friendly and behaviorally informed. Now, let's also talk for a minute about mobile payments. So today we are now in a position to pay by simply tapping our iPhones or our Samsung phones or our mobile phones on a reader. And in fact, perhaps the pioneer of the mobile payment was M-Pesa in Kenya. There's, it's there in Tanzania as well as other parts of Africa as well. But M-Pesa really revolutionized the payment industry. But today we've seen, the Google Wallet. Apple just announced Apple Pay. These are all devices that are fantastic in terms of increasing convenience, but also we might run into problems of metering because it is hard to keep track. It's very easy to pay. Now, having said that, there are some solutions. So think about the following. In Korea, South Korea, every time you use your credit card, you can actually sign up for a service that sends you a text message to remind you that you have made a certain purchase. Now, if you think about an app that you could put on your phone that curates all these text messages and lets you keep track of exactly how much you have spent, that actually overcomes the limitations of the metering problem that we just talked about. Or think about Apple Pay. If Apple Pay through your mobile phone can give you a report on exactly how much you have spent today, yesterday, last week on different product categories, you can now go back to the olden days of clean mental accounting because the technology can do it for you. So while it is true that a lot of these new payment methods can make it difficult to keep track of your mental accounting, the technology might also offer you some solutions in exchange. So what's the verdict? Our verdict is simple. Consumer credit is fantastic. It's a blessing. It is a blessing, but it could become a curse. And as long as you are able to manage the information, as long as you're able to keep track of the mental accounting, as long as you can use tools and devices to help you do that, then consumer credit can be absolutely fantastic because it lets you smooth consumption over time.